Hello, all you YouTubers out there. Thanks for watching at My Life as a Landlord. I hope you learned something today. This is a very critical subject and lots of information. So I hope you have pen and paper ready to go. I hope you learned something. Here we go. Okay. Okay. Well, hello there, all My Life as a Landlord listeners. Thank you so much for joining me today. I am Dr. Jen, and today's episode 57, Advertising Without Discrimination. Oh my goodness. This is such an amazing topic that if you do it wrong or you don't even realize you're doing it wrong, it could really cause some serious problems. As we all know, providing housing, you have to advertise for your rental units, right? But many landlords don't advertise properly. They actually discriminate, which is a big no-no. And you very likely may not be realizing you're doing discrimination in your advertising ads for your rental property. This goes for both US and Canadian landlords. So this is both sides of the border. I've actually researched both sides of the border discrimination for advertising. This is chocked full of resources and information for you. Specifically, we're going to discuss the wording that is in your rental advertising that is discriminatory, which you may not even realize is discriminatory. What happens if you commit the discrimination in your advertising? How would you even know that you did it? And then how to avoid it altogether, which is the whole point. You don't want to discriminate in your advertisements. So let's jump into this. What constitutes discrimination in a rental advertisement? Let's start with Canada and then the US. We'll do that next. Okay, so Canada has something called the Canadian Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms. And I just went to a random province. I just went to Quebec just to say, how does Quebec view the Canadian Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms? And actually, Quebec has a pretty incredible toolbox on their website. It's called For Rent Without Discrimination. And wow, it's got just tons of resources and tools, both for landlords and tenants. I've included the hyperlink on the website for you to check out for my Canadian landlords if you want to check. But the whole idea here is that the Canadian Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms has 14 personal characteristics that are prohibited grounds of discrimination. And here they are. This is quite the list. Race, color, sex, gender identity or gender expression, pregnancy, sexual orientation, civil status, which is the presence of children, age, religion, political convictions, language, ethnic or national origin, social condition, which includes your occupation, income, whether you're on assistance or not, education and or homelessness, and disability is the 14th characteristic. As I mentioned, if you want to see more of this, go to the hyperlink, the Quebec hyperlink to the Canadian Charter of Human Rights, and the Quebec website is actually pretty impressive. So check that out. But let's jump to the US side. That's the Canadian side. Let's jump to the US side. If we're talking about the Fair Housing Act, it is very similar to the Canadian Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms when it comes to discrimination. Fair Housing Act in the US, very similar. And I've also put a PDF attachment for Fair Housing Act Part 109, which is advertisements that includes discriminatory words. You cannot discriminate based on, this is a very similar list, but the Canadians do it a lot more, just a lot more words for the personal characteristics. They use 14. On the US side, they use 9, but you're going to see when they expand the 9, the two lists are almost identical. But here it is. Fair Housing Act Part 109, advertisement, discriminatory prohibitions, race, color, religion, sex, disability, familial status, such as having children, same thing, national origin. And then they go into detail on all of this. So words describing the dwelling or landlord tenants, like white private home, colored home, Jewish home, Hispanic residence, that kind of wording is not permitted. Words indicative of race, color, religion, sex, handicap, familial status, or national origin. Now, race, color, religion, sex. When it comes to sex, it is interesting that the Canadian documentation talks more of gender identity, gender expression, and then sexual orientation is a different list. This one just says sex. But then it comes to handicap, familial status, or national origin. I found this pretty interesting because in the Fair Housing Act, when it came to handicapped, which you're not allowed to use things, the words like crippled, blind, deaf, mentally ill, retarded, impaired, handicapped, physically fit. Those are direct words out of Part 109, Fair Housing Act, not my words. And it says right after this, nothing in this part restricts the inclusion of the information about the availability of the accessibility of the housing, right? So when you're talking about advertising for a rental, Fair Housing Unit Part 109 is talking about just talk more about the accessibility of the unit instead of all of these identifying words that are discriminatory. Yes. Okay, let's go to the next one. Familial status, adults, children, singles, mature persons. You're not allowed to say any of that. But you can say when you're advertising for dwellings which are intended for operated for occupancy of older persons, there is a different part in the Fair Housing Act that is all about housing older folks. And so you can't say adults, children. You can't actually say that. That's discriminating in the Fair Housing Act advertisements. And then this is very interesting on the Fair Housing Act side, the US side, it says no catchwords. Words and phrases used in discriminatory context should be avoided. For example, restricted, exclusive, private, integrated, traditional, board approval, membership approval. And also the Fair Housing Act goes into something that's very different. It doesn't always talk about the words in the advertisement. They talk about how the unit is advertised in the Fair Housing Act. This is very unique. So you've got to be careful on where you are advertising your units, such as certain demographics, certain billboards in certain areas, certain brochures that are distributed in specific areas. Furthermore, they talk about the equal opportunity logo in the Fair Housing Act. I'm not going to go into that now. But what's really interesting is they were talking about how you are using human models in advertising campaigns. You cannot stereotype models of one sex, persons without children, certain demographics. You can't do that. It's really interesting. Now, I never thought of this because where my rentals are relatively small towns, you know, the search engines that I use, the newspaper I put ads in, it's sort of all encompassing. It's not like I'm putting up a billboard in one specific neighborhood. And so it's interesting. So especially if you are in a bigger metropolis, you've got to be careful on where you're placing your ad campaigns that can be discriminative if you are geographic specific or you're using a certain demographic to use as your advertisements. Very interesting. Fair Housing Act talks about that. The Canadian Charter of Human Rights and Freedoms is talking more about just discrimination, prohibited grounds of discrimination. Very interesting how this has all worked, but it's a little bit different. But read it for yourself. Go to the website, Fair Housing Act Part 109. It's a PDF on the website. Also, super, super impressive. Fair Housing Act has created a list of words that you can use in your advertisement that are accepted and not accepted. This is so cool. I'm so happy that they did this. This is super easy. I have put this whole thing on the website. This is a 2-page PDF. First page, it says, so on the top, it says Fair Housing Advertising, words and phrases list. Acceptable. It's all in blue. It's everything that you're allowed to use. There's a couple asterisks when you're talking about older folks. This is the neatest thing. And it sort of gives you a roadmap on what to do, which is great. But it also talks about unacceptable words. It's a 2-pager. Take a look. This is great. PDFs on the website. It really sets you up for success in certain ways, which is great. But let's jump back to Canada for a moment. Talking more about, I'm trying to integrate more Canadian items, even though the Canadian documents and the US documents are almost identical. In the Canadian province of Ontario, the Ontario Human Rights Commission has phrases from landlords that inadvertently suggest that the landlord prefers certain types of people, which is an act of discrimination. Here's some examples. This is really interesting. I guarantee you open up any newspaper, you will see these phrases all over looking for this. And they may not be obvious, which is, people may not intend to do this. Ideal for quiet couple, suitable for single professional, perfect for female student, suits mature individual or couple, great for working folks or adults, not soundproof, which may indicate a bias against families or children, and no pets. Exceptions apply, but you need to know when or where. So this is very interesting because pets, as many of my listeners know, this is a white hot subject when you're talking about pets versus emotional support animals versus service animals, and whether or not you can allow pets or not allow pets. You've got to know your specific geographic area and how this all works for where your rentals are, not where you are, where your rentals are. Okay, let's keep going. Overt discrimination, still prohibited, and includes rejection if the rejection of a potential tenant, receipt of public assistance like welfare, employment insurance, can't reject people on that. Race, color, ethnic origin. This is an interesting one. Age, including 16 or 17-year-olds who are independent of their parents. Let's stop here for a sec. I have done this many, many times where I have a first-time renter, brand new tenant, and I am basically their teaching landlord. Now, some people say, well, Jen, I don't want a project. Okay, fair enough. But it's an opportunity for me to train and to teach them how a landlord should be and how a tenant should be and what they should expect in communication and maintenance for their unit and how they should uphold their unit. So I have no problem with a local cosigner and how I do this. So we do not discriminate, which we're not allowed to, but we're not allowed to discriminate. But there is a specific way on how I do this, and I'm going to do a future podcast on how I do this. I actually enjoy doing it because it includes the family, which is cool. Okay, let's jump back in. Overt discrimination, still prohibited. Familial status, you cannot reject marital status, including people with common law or same-sex partners. You cannot reject based on ancestry, including people of Aboriginal descent. You can't reject based on sex, including pregnancy or gender identity, religious beliefs or practices, place of origin, sexual orientation, disability, citizenship, including refugee status. All very interesting. So, and here's the trick. There is a couple of big asterisks here, which makes this topic so confusing. Some of these are different if it is a roommate situation. Everything I'm talking about is if it's an independent unit. That's typically, if you're listening to my podcast, typically you are probably renting independent units. However, if this is a roommate situation where this is going to be a shared bathroom, shared kitchen with the landlord, with you as the landlord, that is different. So I'm just going to put that out there. I don't want to confuse the situation, but as I was doing this research, that was a big asterisk there. Okay. Here we go. Words and phrases that are not discriminatory. Okay, so this can be a very interesting thing. So let's jump back on the US side from housing and urban development, fair housing and equal opportunity. Advertisements, which I love this term, facially neutral. What does that mean, facially neutral? Yeah, it is interesting because I guess fair housing has gotten complaints over the uses of phrases such as quote unquote rare find, desirable neighborhood, mother-in-law suite, bachelor apartment. They're talking that these complaints are not valid. They're not discriminatory because that's describing the unit, describing the area of the unit potentially. Obviously, again, as we move forward on this, advertising describing the property such as 2-bedroom, cozy, family room, services and facilities, or no bicycles allowed, or quiet streets. They're not, again, facially discriminatory. I love that adverb, facially discriminatory, and do not violate Fair Housing Act. Okay, so there's a whole bunch of resources on this. That's just what the discrimination aspect looks like. That's what the wording looks like. But what happens if you commit discriminatory advertising? There's what happens? So let's talk about what the violations are. Now, as I was researching this, I stumbled upon a website called doorloop.com. Now, I am not a paid advertiser of doorloop.com, but it seems that there's an attorney there called David Bitton. And he does a very interesting, concise way to understand some of this confusing stuff. So if you're interested, check out doorloop.com. I guarantee you it's going to be a resource I use again. But he describes 3 potential violations in discriminating in your advertisements. And so let's go through these 3. Explicit violations used to be they used to be extremely common before the Fair Housing Act was created. And they're exactly what I had said before. Encompasses the language, direct language that clearly states members of certain classes, certain ethnic areas, ethnic background are not welcome based on familial status, national origin, or any of the above mentioned characteristics. For example, a violation may use phrasing like white housing, Jewish home, no children allowed, men's housing only, things like that. He also comments that it's rare to see these kinds of violations nowadays, although some landlords do still describe their their buildings as children free. But he makes the comment that you're more likely to inadvertently violate the Housing and Urban Development Guidelines in one of the following 2 ways. And by the way, I know I'm reading from HUD, and this is a US website, but I can tell you that the Canadian side is very similar. So I'm going to challenge you that if you've got a question, then you need to research it in your local area, but very interesting. So explicit violations is the first one. There's 2 more. Violations by omission. And then the third one is implicit violation. So let's go violation by omission. So this is the easiest one to make without realizing that you've done it. So it's the easiest discrimination that you can do in advertising. And what happens is you fail to make your rental units equally available to the members of different classes in the same income range. So for example, a violation by omission may look like this: failing to make advertisements available in French, even though you live in a multilingual community, right? There's 2 national languages in Canada. That could happen. Advertising in only select geographic areas, such as placing your ads in neighborhoods predominantly home to a single ethnic group, or only using equal housing opportunity logo on some of your advertisements. So that's very common. And if you are in Eastern Canada, that could be applicable to you. So be careful. Now, to have actually a violation of this type to show discrimination, you typically have to show a pattern of offenses in order for there to be fines. But you need to make sure you understand the difference. He even has one example in here. For example, not making any of your ads available in French may be a violation, but failing to translate 1 or 2 ads may not be one. So take a look. If you're in a bilingual or multilingual place, that may apply. Okay, the third violation type, how would you even know that you've committed discrimination in your advertisements? Implicit violations are those that occur without the use of explicit discriminatory language. Okay, well, it's even more confusing. For example, you can be guilty of an implicit HUD violation, advertising guidelines, by only showing advertisements featuring a certain ethnic group. And this goes back to posters, commercials, brochures, using coded language that shows a clear preference for members of certain religious groups, for example, and excessively highlighting features that make disabled residents less likely to apply. Interesting. The point of this category is that housing and urban development doesn't want landlords to try to get around fair housing guidelines by using coded language and practices instead of being explicit. These can be just as severe from a legal standpoint as just explicit discrimination. So you want to be careful. You don't want to code things up. So how would you know if you discriminated in your advertising? How would you even know? I mean, if you're actually advertising and you're discriminating in your advertisements and you don't realize it, how would you actually know? Okay, well, you might get a flag on your advertising method online, i.e. Craigslist, Facebook, something else may quote unquote flag the ad, right? And this has happened on Craigslist. In fact, this happened one time. We were looking for a quote unquote cleaning lady. We put this ad up, didn't even think about it. We got flagged on Craigslist and we went, what did we do wrong? We looked at scoured through the whole job description, the scope of work. What were we doing? It was the word lady, cleaning person. We didn't even realize it. And this is where we went, okay, it got flagged. Let's fix it. And as soon as we fixed it, put cleaning person, put the ad back up, didn't get flagged. So we didn't even realize it. Wow. Okay. So you might get a flag like that. You could potentially get a notice of complaint from the Housing and Urban Development. if you're in the United States, or you might get a notice from your state or province or territory's third party regarding civil rights. Okay, what would that look like? And then if you do get one of those, then what? Okay, in the US, if you violate HUD's guidelines and commit discriminatory advertising, a few things can happen. First, you may be legally required to rent the, so let's go down this. I'm starting to read this, but let's talk about the scenario. Let's say you've discriminated, you don't even realize you discriminated, or you're talking a coded language in your ads, or you've put them in, you've committed some kind of discriminatory act in your advertisement. So the first thing that may happen is you still may be legally required to rent the unit against or to the individual that was discriminated against. You still may be legally liable to rent to them. However, because of this, they may not want to take the unit, which is understandable, unfortunately. What's more likely to happen is that you will be required to pay damages to the person who successfully sued you for discriminatory advertising. And that may include pain and suffering, cost of renting a hotel or other temporary housing due to the rejection or not able to rent your unit. That may also include attorney's fees and other charges stemming from the discriminatory incident. Bottom line is that you're likely going to have to pay a fair amount of money if found guilty. And this is likely to be super stressful. I see on Facebook, both sides of the border, that there's all kinds of stress going on when dealing with tenants, with evictions, with trying to get their money back, dealing with trashed units. This type of event is, I would say, equally as stressful, just because you've got to be involved, and it's stressful. But this one is completely avoidable. Okay, in Canada, I had mentioned in Canada, you might get a letter from a third party, state, province, territory's third party regarding civil rights. For example, BC Civil Rights Tribunal or Ontario Human Rights Commission, which I mentioned, for example, but it's location dependent in Canada. But here's the trick. How do you avoid all of this, right? How do you avoid the stress? How do you avoid just any of these violations? How do you do it right? Okay. Here it is. The rule of thumb for avoiding discriminatory advertising is to market the property and amenities, not the people you think should live in it, right? I'll say it again. Market the property and its amenities only, not the people you think should live in it. If you do, that will likely avoid discriminatory anything in your advertisements. Rental advertising best practices includes attracting the right tenants for your property. And in your advertisements, you describe the unit, not the tenant. Use the Fair Housing Act's list of acceptable words in advertising. And I can tell you there's 3 columns of words. There's easily 60 words that you can put in here. List the rent, size of apartment, amenities, and other appealing features of the property, not the ideal person or people that you think should reside in that unit. Now, I'm going to do a whole podcast on how to properly market your unit. And guess what? None of it will be on who you think the tenants should be. It's all about marketing the unit. So there's lots of spin-off podcasts from today. Oh my goodness. Wow. This has been a lot of information, but here we go. As we conclude today's podcast, we discussed many aspects of advertising your rental without discrimination. I talked on both sides of the border, both the US and Canada's discriminatory specific wording in your rental advertisements. What happens if you do commit a discriminatory advertising campaign? How would you even know? And then how to avoid it. Discrimination in your advertisements. There are 5 resources on the website, mylifeasalandlord.com, for you to take a look at, either by hyperlink or by PDFs. Please go and see these resources, download them, especially the Fair Housing list of acceptable and not acceptable words in advertising your rentals. That is absolutely key. So here's your call to action. Call to action to all my landlords, US and Canadian landlords. Here we go. Check your advertisements and your ad campaign. With everything that I just discussed, with all the resources that are on the website, it is easy that you can make mistakes, but check yourself. You have a whole laundry list of things to look at now that you can actually correct your own advertisements. If you are a landlord and you've been a landlord for a long time, and you have, let's say you have cookie cutter ads for your different units that you have. And when someone gives notice that they're going to depart, you just cut and paste and put it back in. Well, check those. Make sure they're okay. Make sure you're not inadvertently speaking in coded wording or, describing the tenants that are going to be in there. Make sure that you're not doing that. The other thing that you can do, especially if you've got multiple layers of tenancy law. So if you've got, let's say you're in the state of Washington and then the city of Seattle, you have several layers of tenancy documents that you need to go through. So make sure you're in compliance with all of those. Also, if you've got questions on the discriminatory wording, if you have questions, whether you're in Canada or US, there is a local legal aid society or local nonprofit or a third party, either mediation or arbitration. One of those items will apply in your area somewhere, one of those. Call them and ask them questions about how you should advertise your rental. They don't want you to mess this up. They want you to use them as a resource. So make sure that you are educating yourself in your specific area. Okay, so that's your call to action today. Check your ads, educate yourself. Whew. Let me know your comments and questions by emailing me at learn@mylifeasalandlord.com. Questions and comments, create the next podcast and resources. Also, I am on the hunt for really great guests. 2024 is going to be all about guests. So if you know of a really great guest that I should have on the show, there is a podcast guest application on the website as well. I'm always looking for dynamic guests to bring the value to all of you. Don't forget the resources on the website, including all the ways to invest in your continuing landlord education. Check out My Life as a Landlord for more details. Join me for next week's podcast where I interview my podcast coach, episode number 58, Starting a Podcast with Sydney Young. I will see you there.